The tape was never supposed to exist in silence. Somewhere in a vault, on a shelf nobody talks about, sits a reel of film that America never saw. A performance so charged, so combustible, that the moment cameras stopped rolling, an empire 3 decades in the making simply stopped breathing. No goodbye episode. No farewell tour. No explanation to the millions of fans who had tuned in every Saturday morning like it was church. Just an abrupt, permanent silence where a cultural institution used to be. Somewhere between the final cut and the next scheduled taping, something happened behind those studio doors that networks decided the world could never see, and for nearly 2 decades, almost no one has been willing to say exactly what. Tonight we're going back to that room. Back to the moment the train derailed. And by the end you'll understand not just what ended Soul Train, but what it cost the man who built it to watch it die. To understand how something so powerful could be extinguished so quietly, you have to understand the man behind it, because Soul Train was never really a television show. It was a reckoning, built by a black man from Chicago's South Side who had spent his early life watching his own community erased from American screens. Don Cornelius wasn't a media executive. He'd worked as a traffic cop and an insurance salesman before he ever touched a microphone. But somewhere underneath the ordinary jobs was a conviction that refused to let go of him. That black culture deserved more than a token appearance on someone else's stage. It deserved ownership. It deserved the wheel. And in 1970, with nothing but a local Chicago broadcast and an unshakable sense of purpose, Cornelius built himself a train, and put himself squarely in the driver's seat. What he built next shouldn't have worked. Networks didn't syndicate shows helmed entirely by black creators. Advertisers didn't believe black audiences were worth targeting directly. And yet, within a year, Cornelius had taken his defiantly independent little program and pushed it into national syndication, station by station, market by market, until, by the fall of 1971, Soul Train was rolling across the entire country, uncontrolled by any network, unfiltered by any studio executive who didn't understand the culture he was protecting. He signed sponsors who had never before considered black consumers a serious market. He kept the creative reins in his own hands. And every Saturday morning millions of people watched something they'd never been allowed to see before. Themselves reflected back with dignity, rhythm, and pride. For a while it felt untouchable. The Soul Train line became more than a dance segment. It became a democratic stage where anyone, regardless of fame or training, could step into the spotlight and become, for the length of one song, a star. Ordinary teenagers from ordinary neighborhoods strutted down that aisle and briefly owned the entire nation's attention. Some of them, like a young dancer named Rosie Perez, would ride that spotlight into real careers. Most wouldn't. But for that one performance it didn't matter, because the show had proven something radical. That talent alone, stripped of pedigree and permission, could command a room. And week after week, the show didn't just showcase black music. It set the terms for black style itself. The afros, the platform shoes, the sequins, the bold prints that traced back to African roots, turning what mainstream media had once mocked into something the entire country wanted to imitate. Behind all of it stood Cornelius, obsessive about every frame. He personally corrected choreography he thought went too far. He vetoed costumes that felt undignified. He believed, fiercely, that if the show slipped even slightly from elegance into spectacle, it would hand ammunition to everyone who doubted a black-owned production could survive on national television. That instinct built something extraordinary, a show so polished, so controlled, that it lasted decades where far bigger productions collapsed in years. But that same instinct came with a cost. Dancers who wanted to push boundaries found themselves reined in. Choreographers who wanted to experiment found their ideas quietly shelved. Rosie Perez herself would later describe being told to tone down routines Cornelius considered too provocative. The train ran exactly where its conductor wanted it to run, and nowhere else. For years that discipline was the show's greatest strength. And then the music itself began to change beneath his feet. By the late 1980s, a new sound was clawing its way out of the underground and into the mainstream, raw, unpolished, unapologetically loud in a way Soul Train had never been built to hold. Hip-hop wasn't asking for permission the way earlier acts had. It didn't soften its language for network approval. And Cornelius, the same man who had once fought so hard to put dignity on the screen, looked at this new genre and saw something he didn't recognize as his mission. He hesitated. He filtered. He kept much of it at arm's length, worried that the raw edges of the culture he'd spent 30 years defending might undo everything he'd built to protect it. It was the first crack in the armor. And the culture did not wait for him to catch up. While Soul Train hesitated, other platforms rushed in to fill the silence. A new show called Yo! MTV Raps threw open its doors to the artists Cornelius kept at a distance. Rap City followed, embracing the same raw, unfiltered energy Soul Train had tried to keep contained. An entire generation of young viewers, the exact audience Cornelius had once fought to give a mirror to, began finding that mirror somewhere else. Ratings that had once felt untouchable began, quietly and then not so quietly, to slide. By the time Soul Train tried to correct course, folding a handful of rap acts into its later lineups, it was already being called too little, arriving far too late. The train that had once set the pace for black culture in America was now chasing behind it. And then came the night that ended everything. By 2006, the show that had once run like a precision machine was unraveling behind the scenes. Staff had been shuffled at the last minute. Technical delays stacked on top of one another. Performers arrived late, unprepared if they arrived at all. Longtime crew members would later describe the set that day not with the confident hum of a well-oiled production, but with something closer to dread, a tense, directionless scramble with no one steering the ship. Cornelius himself, no longer officially running day-to-day production but unable to fully let go, was said to be hovering somewhere backstage, watching the chaos with a kind of quiet horror. Then came the performance. An up-and-coming hip-hop artist took the stage that day with choreography and staging that pushed further than anything the show had ever allowed onto its screen. A set built on the kind of raw, provocative energy Cornelius had spent 36 years carefully keeping at bay. Sources close to the production describe it only in fragments. Costumes that would have been unthinkable in the show's early years, staging elements no one had cleared, an atmosphere that felt less like Soul Train and more like something the show had always defined itself against. What exactly unfolded on that stage has never been made public. The tape was never aired. It was never leaked, never bootlegged, never surfaced in the decades of archival footage that fans have painstakingly restored and uploaded since. It exists, if it exists at all, only in the memories of the handful of people who were in that room, and in the tense, urgent phone calls that followed almost immediately after. Because within hours the fallout began. Cornelius reportedly called an emergency meeting with the show's distribution partners, trying to contain the damage before it spread. It didn't work. Tribune Entertainment, the partner responsible for getting Soul Train onto local stations across the country, pulled its support. Without that distribution, there was no way to guarantee airtime, no way to justify the production costs, no way to keep the machine running. Affiliates began quietly dropping the show. No formal cancellation was ever announced. No farewell special aired. The show that had defined 36 years of Saturday mornings simply stopped. One controversial, unaired performance had done what 3 decades of cultural shifts, rival networks and declining ratings never fully managed. It pulled the plug entirely in a single afternoon, without a word of explanation to the audience that had shown up faithfully for generations. But the real cost of that silence wasn't just measured in cancelled episodes. For Don Cornelius, Soul Train wasn't a job he could simply walk away from, it was the architecture of his entire identity. He had spent 36 years being the man who gave Black America a mirror, and when that mirror shattered without warning, without a goodbye, without any closure for the audience or for himself, something in him seemed to shatter along with it. He withdrew from public life almost entirely. The man who had once stood confidently at the center of American television stopped giving interviews, stopped appearing at cultural events, stopped being seen. Those close to him described a quiet, corrosive bitterness. A sense that after decades of building something the culture desperately needed, he'd been discarded by the very system he'd helped transform, with no acknowledgement of what he'd sacrificed to build it. The years that followed only deepened the isolation. A 2008 arrest for domestic violence brought a wave of unwanted, painful public scrutiny to a man who had already retreated from the spotlight. Health struggles, reportedly connected to complications from an earlier brain surgery, added physical pain to psychological weight. Piece by piece, the man who had spent his life building a platform for others seemed unable to find solid ground beneath his own feet. The train had stopped. And its conductor, for the first time in his life, had nowhere left to go. And yet, somehow the story didn't end there. Years after the cameras went dark, something unexpected happened. A new generation, born long after the show's original run, began stumbling onto grainy uploaded clips of the Soul Train line. The dancers, the fashion, the unmistakable swagger of a show that had once refused to ask permission to exist. Old VHS tapes, lovingly preserved by superfans, found their way onto YouTube. Dance challenges inspired by that original line began spreading across TikTok and Instagram, carried by artists who'd never lived through the show's original golden years but instantly recognized its spirit. The Smithsonian eventually welcomed pieces of the show's history into its permanent collection. Costumes, set pieces, fragments of a legacy now formally recognized as American history rather than simple entertainment. A dramatized series brought Cornelius's story to a new audience who'd never heard his name. The train Don Cornelius built didn't survive the way he might have wanted it to. It didn't get the farewell episode it deserved. It didn't get to end on its own terms, in front of the audience that had loved it for 36 years. But somewhere in the space between a shelved, unaired tape and a viral dance challenge decades later, that train found its way back onto the tracks. Not through the man who built it, but through the millions of people who never forgot what it meant to see themselves fully and proudly reflected on a screen that had once told them they didn't belong there at all.